This is part two of Module 1C. That's war and diplomacy. Bismarckian diplomacy. In the part one of Module 1C, we looked at the first part of Bismarck's attempt to create a diplomatic web that would maintain an isolation of France. And we were about to start looking at the various diplomatic alliances and congresses that Bismarck put in place in order to maintain this very, very important web. So, as we said in the part one of module 1C, we discussed the creation of the Dreikaiserbund by Bismarck in 1873 and how it helped to isolate France and keep France on hold. But subsequently, after that, if we look at our chronology here, we will see that in 1875, between 1875 and 1876, there were certain reforms that took place in the Ottoman Empire. And if we look at this map here, we'll see that the Ottoman Empire is just somewhere around here, covering, the some of the Balkan states. Okay, and those reforms that took place in the Ottoman Empire were reforms that affected the Christian nations in the Ottoman Empire, and the Christian nations, the Christian ethnicities that were within the Ottoman Empire normally looked at Russia, for protection, and this created some form of diplomatic row between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And this particular incident, which we see right here, the uh, the failed reforms in the Ottoman Empire in 1875 resulted into what we refer to as the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. Now, this conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire had a profound effect on the politics of Europe. It had very profound effect on the politics of Europe, and it resulted into Bismarck calling for a Congress. We can see right here, Bismarck called for a Congress right here in 1878. Now, the Congress that Bismarck called for in 1878 in Berlin was an attempt to settle the problems, to mediate between these great empires, the Ottoman Empire and also the Russian Empire, in order to settle the problem that was created between them. Now, the interest of Bismarck in Balkan politics was the fact that whatever happened in the Balkans, that is in the area where the Russians and the Ottoman Empire had, had collided, whatever happens there will affect the politics of Central Europe, because it was not just the Russians that were involved in the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarians were also involved in the Balkans, the Ottomans were also involved in the Balkans, and even the French and the British were involved in the Balkans. So Bismarck understood that if the situation in the Balkans became worse and eventually resulted into war, it was going to destabilize the balance of power in Europe, because the European powers, both the Western and the Central European powers, would be involved in the war that was taking place in Eastern Europe, because the Balkans is in Eastern Europe. But the powers in Western and Central Europe all had connections in the Balkans, which was in Eastern Europe. So it was in the interest of Bismarck, because now he was somebody that was looking at bringing about peace, preventing war, so on and so forth. So it was in his interest to make sure that this conflict didn't take place. However, the 1878 Congress in Berlin did not necessarily bring about the kind of results that Bismarck had envisaged. So, but this created a situation between the German Empire and the Russian Empire, in the sense that the settlement in the Congress of Berlin was not to the advantage of the Russians. And as a result of that, the Russians pulled out of the Dreikaiserbund. Now, when the Russians pulled out of the Dreikaiserbund, Bismarck went ahead in 1879 to create what is called the Dual Alliance between the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the purpose of the Dual Alliance was to give Russia an understanding that there are two mighty empires in Central Europe, the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were in agreement in diplomatic friendship, and it was to the advantage of the Russians to be friends with these two great powers, and we can see that that subsequently led in 1881 to a renewal of the Dreikaiserbund, because at this point in time, the Russians realized that it was to their own advantage to be part of the Dreikaiserbund. So in 1881, the Russians came back into the Dreikaiserbund and they renewed the Dreikaiserbund, this friendship between the three emperors, and the status quo was maintained in Europe. However, in 1882, moving on to 1882, Bismarck went ahead to solidify relations between Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy in what is called the 1882 Triple Alliance. Now, this Triple Alliance, which Bismarck created, was in lieu of the collapse of the Dreikaiserbund. Now, having understood that the Russians were no longer interested, okay, in the Dreikaiserbund, but rather they had come into some form of, renewal. It was clear to Bismarck that the relationship between the Russians and the Austrians and the Germans were not very stable. So Bismarck intended to create something that was more stronger, more stable, more solid. So the Triple Alliance, okay, between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy was a defensive alliance that essentially maintained that if Germany was attacked by any extraneous power, or Austria-Hungary was attacked by any extraneous power, then all the other three powers would, assist any of the powers that were attacked within this alliance and fight against that extraneous power. This was a very strong alliance. It was a very strong alliance, and it attracted the attention of the Russians, which eventually led to the 1887 reassurance. So the terms of the reassurance treaty was that Russia approached Germany and they entered into essentially a defensive pact in which any instance in which Austria, Hungary as an empire attacked Russia, Germany was supposed to stay neutral. Or if France were to attack Germany, Russia would stay neutral. So this was the terms of the reassurance treaty. It was actually established in order to reinsure the relationship between Germany and Russia, the Russian Empire, that in the case of war, certain conflicts that involve certain mutual interests in the diplomatic circle, then they were assured that the other party would not join into that conflict or would not be part of that conflict. So essentially, Bismarck was now able to insure himself against any form of conflict that would involve France and another power. That means if Germany was involved in war with France, Bismarck was certain that Russia would not be part of that conflict. Russia will not join that conflict in support of France. So essentially, Bismarck had been able to effectively isolate France in Europe, so that France doesn't have any strategic friends, any diplomatic friends that she could use in any kind of conflict against Germany. Now, this was the network of diplomatic forays that Bismarck had engaged in order to effectively isolate France and maintain the status quo of peace in Europe. However, eventually Bismarck had to resign in 1890 because he was having challenges with the new emperor. Of course, Kaiser William I had died, and the throne, his son had ascended the throne, Kaiser William II, and they didn't, they didn't see eye to eye on some international policies or foreign policies that Bismarck had maintained during his period as German Chancellor. So this brings us to the end of the second part of Module 1C. We're going to move forward with another module which will cover another topic in our next class.